Hello everyone, and welcome to my Sister Wives For You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The moment the news broke inside the Brown family circle, the energy in the room shifted like someone had cracked open a long-sealed vault of resentment, secrets, and unspoken truths. For months, the atmosphere around Kody and Janelle had been thick with tension, a strained truce built on the vague hope that time alone could stitch together the frayed edges of their marriage. But time had only deepened the divide, and on that day, when Janelle finally exposed what she had been holding back, the fracture spread so far across the family that even the children could feel the tremor. The revelation was simple, yet seismic. Kody had absolutely no idea that Madison was pregnant again. It wasn't a small oversight or a case of delayed communication. It was a glaring sign of just how disengaged he had become from Janelle's side of the family, the very side that had once been his anchor of stability. And the moment Janelle said it, her voice steady, but her eyes burning, the family exploded in ways no one could have predicted. For Janelle, the decision to reveal the truth had been simmering for weeks. She hadn't wanted it to become a spectacle, nor had she intended to use Madison's news as ammunition. But the moment arrived naturally, almost inevitably, during yet another heated argument about Kody's absence, his selective involvement, and his insistence that the wives needed to meet him in the middle. Janelle had been listening silently, arms folded, frustration tightening her chest as Kody lectured her about communication, commitment, and how he felt unwelcome in her branch of the family. It was then that something snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. She realized he was lecturing her about a family he no longer even knew. So she said it, plain and sharp. "You didn't even know Madison is pregnant." The room froze. Kody blinked, confusion spreading across his face before morphing into disbelief, then into defensive indignation. Classic stages of being confronted with a truth he wasn't prepared to handle. Everyone present felt the shock ripple outward. Christine, who had been trying to maintain neutrality since stepping away from the marriage, gasped audibly. Robin's face went pale as she darted a glance at Kody, already anticipating the meltdown she knew was coming. Even Mary, often reserved and ghost-like in family gatherings by then, visibly stiffened. The children, gathered on the periphery, exchanged looks, half anger, half vindication. Because they had known. They had all known, except the one person who, in their eyes, should have known. And that absence of awareness said more than any accusation could. Kody's response detonated the moment. He insisted he would have known if someone had bothered to tell him. He claimed he had been left out intentionally, that the wives, especially Janelle, had been withholding information as a way of punishing him. But the more he spoke, the more glaringly obvious it became that the problem wasn't a lack of access, but a lack of effort. Madison had posted subtle hints online. She had mentioned it casually in a family group chat he rarely read. She had spoken with her siblings openly about it. To everyone else, the announcement hadn't been a secret. It had been a joyful, normal family update. Only to Kody was it some clandestine, orchestrated omission. Janelle countered quietly, but her restraint made the blow land harder. "You didn't know because you haven't been present. Not for me. Not for the kids. Not for anyone outside the walls of one house." It was a truth the entire family had been dancing around for years, a reality softened by excuses and blurred by emotional fatigue. But hearing it stated bluntly forced everyone to confront what they had already felt. That Kody's world had narrowed so drastically that he had become a visitor, not a participant, in the broader family. The argument snowballed from there, unearthing grievances that had gone unspoken for far too long. The older children, especially those closest to Janelle, stepped forward with their own frustrations. They reminded him of missed birthdays, forgotten conversations, canceled visits. They pointed out that the emotional vacuum wasn't new. It had been widening for years. And for once, the conversation wasn't dominated by Kody's voice. He tried to redirect, to blame the women's negative energy, to accuse the kids of being poisoned by resentment. But no one was buying it anymore. The family had reached a collective breaking point, and the truth was larger, than his usual strategies for deflection. Madison herself wasn't present during the explosion, but word traveled quickly. When she heard how the revelation had detonated the family's lingering tensions, she sighed. Not surprised, not amused, simply sad. Because while she loved her father, she had grown used to him being peripheral. She had learned, painfully, to expect little. But she hadn't anticipated that her pregnancy, something meant to bring happiness, hope, and family unity, would become the spark that ignited a long-brewing confrontation. She later told her siblings that she wished things had been different, but she wasn't willing to pretend anymore. If her father wanted to be involved, he had every opportunity. But involvement required presence, and presence required choosing them. And he simply hadn't been choosing them. Back at the family gathering, the atmosphere deteriorated rapidly. Robin, overwhelmed and shaken, tried to intervene. She insisted that Kody did care, that he was just stretched thin, emotionally drained and misunderstood. But those words only fueled the fire. To the older kids and the other wives, Robin's attempts at justification felt like a continuation of the narrative that had fractured the family in the first place, the idea that Kody's shortcomings were everyone else's responsibility to cushion, interpret, and accommodate. Even Christine, who had spent so long trying to disengage from battles that no longer belonged to her, finally spoke.
She didn't yell.
She didn't accuse. She simply said, "Caring isn't about what you say. It's about what you show." And that truth, delivered with heartbreaking calm, pierced the room more deeply than any anger could have. Kody spiraled.
He paced.
He argued in circles. He insisted that he had tried, but that no one had met him halfway. He pointed to his emotional wounds, the family conflicts, the breakdown of plural marriage cohesion. But Janelle didn't back down. She reminded him that relationships, especially with children, couldn't hinge on perfect circumstances. Effort had to be unconditional. Attention had to be intentional. And knowledge, like something as monumental as one's own daughter being pregnant, wasn't something that should ever slip through the cracks for a father who claimed he was doing his best. By the end of the confrontation, the family was emotionally exhausted. Some were crying. Some were silent. Some simply left the room to cool down. But the collective realization lingering in the air was unmistakable. The family they had once been wasn't coming back. Too much distance had grown. Too many wounds had gone untreated. And too many moments, big ones like this, had been missed. For Janelle, exposing the truth wasn't an act of vindictiveness. It was an act of liberation. She had spent years minimizing, rationalizing, and swallowing her emotional needs for the sake of keeping peace. But the moment she spoke the truth aloud, she freed herself from carrying the weight alone. She didn't have to protect Kody from the consequences of his own detachment anymore. She didn't have to pretend that the bond was still intact. She simply had to acknowledge reality. In the aftermath, the family reevaluated their roles, their bonds, and their expectations. The children rallied around Madison with joy, excitement, and undiluted love, everything she had hoped for. The wives talked among themselves, some grieving, some relieved. And Kody, shaken and angry, retreated into defensiveness, still refusing to accept the deeper meaning behind what the family had shown him. But the truth was no longer hidden or softened. It had been spoken, loudly and clearly. And once exposed, it couldn't be pushed back into silence. Madison's pregnancy, intended as a moment of joy, became the mirror that forced the Brown family to see themselves honestly. And while the explosion was painful, it also marked a turning point, the moment when excuses fell away, when truth became unavoidable, and when Janelle finally stepped into her own strength, no longer willing to minimize her reality for the sake of preserving an illusion of unity. In the days that followed the explosive confrontation, the ripple effects continued spreading through the family like aftershocks from a long-dormant fault line finally awakening. Though everyone tried to return to some version of normal, conversations were stilted, phone calls were shorter, and every interaction seemed to carry the quiet awareness that nothing would ever be exactly as it once was. Janelle felt an unexpected mixture of relief and sorrow, relief that the truth was finally in the open, and sorrow that it had taken such an emotional detonation to force the family to confront just how disconnected their patriarch had become. She hadn't wanted to humiliate Kody or expose him in front of the children. But she had grown tired of being the one who kept the peace while her own emotional needs were buried under years of compromise. Meanwhile, Kody nursed his bruised ego, replaying the confrontation in his mind with an internal narration that painted him as the misunderstood victim. He told himself that they had ganged up on him, that the wives were rewriting history, that the children didn't appreciate the sacrifices he had made. But beneath the defensiveness lingered a stubborn, uncomfortable truth he refused to acknowledge fully. He had been drifting for years. And the family's collective reaction wasn't a coordinated attack. It was the echo of years of absence. Still, admitting that felt like accepting defeat. So, he continued constructing stories about why he had been left out, never once considering that he had excluded himself long before anyone stopped trying. The children, however, weren't interested in protecting narratives anymore. Many of them privately admitted that hearing Kody panic about not knowing the pregnancy news had been strangely validating. For so long they had been told that their perception of his absence was exaggerated, that they weren't giving him enough credit or empathy. But seeing his ignorance exposed so publicly revealed the truth they had always sensed. Their father's emotional universe had become very small, and most of them were no longer inside of it. For them, Madison's pregnancy wasn't just another milestone. It was a symbol of how far the family had drifted from the man who once insisted plural marriage was the core of his identity. When Madison finally spoke to Kody after the confrontation, the call was quiet, polite, but undeniably distant. She didn't scold him, nor did she pretend everything was fine. She simply updated him on her health, mentioned the baby's due date, and then allowed silence to fill the conversation. Kody tried to break the awkwardness with a few questions, but the connection between them felt thin, fragile, almost formal. She hung up feeling a mix of sadness and acceptance, realizing that she no longer felt angry, just attached. She had her own children to think about now, her own emotional world to cultivate. And she wasn't willing to shoulder the burden of repairing a relationship that only one person was fighting for. As for the wives, the confrontation acted as a turning point they couldn't ignore. It became clear that pretending everything was reparable only prolonged the hurt. And while they didn't agree on everything, they did share one profound realization. They were allowed to prioritize their well-being, even if it meant stepping away from the structure that had defined their lives for decades. The unspoken truth was that the family hadn't shattered that day. It had been broken long before. The revelation only made the cracks impossible to deny.